Welcome, everybody, to our program on deer in your woods. My name is Lisa Sawsville, and I'm with Vermont Coverts, Woodlands for Wildlife. And we are a nonprofit in Vermont that is a peer-to-peer organization working with landowners to educate them about sound forest stewardship and wildlife management. You're welcome to sign up for our e-news online at our website. Check out our new website that went live last week or the week before, and our new logo, which we're really excited about. And certainly, join us for any of our other programs. Today we have Nick Fortin with us. Nick is a biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and he heads up the deer program. And he's going to talk to us a little bit about the deer in your woods. What can you do to enhance their habitat? What can you do if there's deer damage going on? And really share with us the status of the population. We will not be covering anything about the upcoming changes to the seasons. There will be some March meetings hosted by the department to discuss those, and you can join those. As far as questions, we will take questions in the chat box. So if you have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat box, and I will relay them to Nick at the end, and we'll have a little discussion that way. We ask that you mute yourselves so that there is no background noise, and you're welcome to keep your cameras on or off. That's entirely up to you, but we are recording this. Just be aware of that. And we'll post it to our YouTube channel for you or anyone to watch at a later date. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Nick and let him get started. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. Let me pull up my presentation here and we can get going. So hopefully you can all see that. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm gonna discuss kind of deer in your woods this afternoon, or a little bit about a status of our deer population and the status of our forests in relation to that deer population. So in getting into that, I want to make this work. So there are three main factors that drive our deer population in Vermont. Those are winter weather, specifically the length, severity of our winters, hunting pressure, and the quantity and quality of deer habitat. And all of those factors vary considerably across Vermont. We're a fairly small state, but winter severity varies considerably from one area to another. Hunting pressure varies considerably from one area to another. And the quality of deer habitat can vary a lot from often very close areas, one area to maybe the next town or next property over. So to kind of walk through those, winter is in many parts of Vermont still the primary driving factor behind how many deer we have and how many deer we can have. We track the impact of winter on the deer population using a winter severity index. And this is just a chart of that each year over the past 30 years. Obviously, we don't have numbers for 2021 yet, but if all tracks relatively normal from here on out, we'd be looking at a winter severity index somewhere around 30. So what this index does is it counts the number of days when there's 18 inches of snow on the ground or more, the number of days where the temperature drops below zero, and sums those up through the winter. What we've found historically in Vermont is anytime we see a winter severity of roughly 50 or more statewide, we typically see a decline in our deer population. When the winter severity is less than that, the deer population can increase if hunting doesn't limit it. And over time, as with anything with climate change, as we would expect, our winters are generally getting less severe, but they're also getting more variable. So we still have regular severe winters, and those still limit deer in certain parts of Vermont. Now, like I said earlier, winters aren't the same everywhere in Vermont. They vary a lot from one region to another. Generally speaking, winters tend to be much more severe in the Northeast Kingdom than they are in the Champlain Valley, or most of southern Vermont, other than the spine of the Green Mountains. And that's consistent long-term. The map on the right here is a 30-year average winter severity. The map on the left is the winter severity in 2020, which was a relatively easy year, but even in an easy year, winters in the Northeast Kingdom are still fairly difficult for deer. Another major factor driving deer numbers is hunting, right? And most people, when they think of hunting, they picture a hunter with a big buck, right? Like this. But when we're talking about hunting in terms of its effect on deer numbers, or attempting to manage deer numbers, we're really talking about harvesting female deer. The doe harvest is what determines what impact is what really impacts the deer population, right? The number of female deer in the population determines how many deer we're going to have next year. Doesn't really matter how many bucks we kill, because of deer's breeding system, where a buck can breed with multiple does. And so reducing our buck population really has no impact on how many deer are around the following year. It's the number of does that really matters. And so that's how we attempt to control deer numbers through hunting. So in Vermont, to sort of attempt to manage our hunting regionally, to address those variations in habitat quality or winter severity, we divide the state into 21 wildlife management units, and we set our hunting regulations for all big game species based on these units. So we may have different rules in certain WMUs than we do in others. We also set our numbers of antlerless permits that we issue each year based on these units. So we can issue more in a certain WMU, say WMU-A or B up in the northwestern part of the state, because we have too many deer there and we want to reduce deer numbers. We can issue few or any permits in some of the other units. For example, WMUs E1 and E2 up in the northeastern part of the state, we haven't issued antlerless permits in since 2004, I believe. So 15 plus years now. So in Vermont, we have, well, technically we now have 6 different deer hunting seasons, but for simplicity, we basically have 4 different seasons that we deal with. Antlerless deer, does and fawns can be harvested in any season in Vermont except our regular November rifle season. And there's some history behind that I'll get into in a bit, but generally speaking, when we're trying to manage does, we're focused on our other hunting seasons, not the regular November season. So archery season is our, as a deer manager, it is the preferred way to harvest antlerless deer, to manage antlerless overall deer numbers. The reason for that is because of the nature of archery hunting. Hunters tend to focus their effort, and therefore where they harvest deer, on areas with more deer. As a result, they tend to, most of the deer get harvested in areas where there are a lot of deer, and few, if any, deer get harvested in areas with few deer. So it really targets the places we need to harvest more deer on its own. And so we really don't restrict archery hunting very much. We kind of just let hunters go. It's naturally difficult just by the nature of it. So there's no risk of over harvesting through archery hunting. So we kind of just let hunters go there. Our youth season, and now our new novice season for new adult hunters. Those hunters are also allowed to harvest any deer anywhere in the state, but because there are relatively few hunters during that season, it really doesn't have a big impact on anything. But it is part of that overall total. And then the way we really tweak our antlerless harvest in each area is in our muzzleloader season, which as of last year is actually now 2 seasons. There's a 4-day one in October, and then the traditional one in December. But that is the season where we allocate antlerless deer permits, and we adjust the number of permits available in each wildlife management unit. So a hunter, in order to harvest an antlerless deer in that season, has to have a permit. And so that season is really the key one for adjusting our harvest as necessary. And then the final factor, and I'm going to argue the most important factor in determining deer numbers in Vermont, is habitat. Habitat is the primary driver. It trumps everything else. Anywhere we have good quality deer habitat, we'll have plenty of deer, always. Anywhere we have poor deer habitat, we're not going to have many deer, no matter what we try to do to change that. So it really, in the end, comes down to habitat. And just like every other wildlife species, there are 4 key elements of deer habitat that we need to consider: food, water, cover, and space. I think food's an obvious important one, right? Deer need plenty of forage to be fat and happy and healthy. Water is one that everything needs, but water is not a real concern in this part of the world. There's a lot of water in Vermont, and deer get a lot of water from the food they eat. So water isn't something we usually have to consider here. Cover is critically important for deer, helps them avoid predators, helps them feel secure. I'm sure many of you have watched deer in your lifetimes. They're a fairly skittish creature. They like to feel secure, and so providing some areas where they can not feel exposed are important. And then the final one is space. Deer aren't super territorial, but at certain times of year they can be. And so space sometimes comes into play, but again, in Vermont, it's not a major consideration. We're not usually dealing with super high numbers or densities of deer to where just the stress of being overcrowded is a real concern. So really, the ones I'm going to focus on here, and the ones I think that are most important, are food and cover. And we're talking about deer habitat in Vermont. What we're really talking about, or what we're really focused on, is forest habitat. Vermont is a heavily forested state, one of the most forested states in the country, and 80% of what we consider deer habitat is forest. So the health and the productivity of our forest from a deer's perspective is really what drives the overall productivity of our deer habitat on a statewide basis. And so before I get into the current status of our deer population, I think it's important to kind of go over some history. I think it's important to understand how we got to where we are, and provide a little perspective, maybe why we are where we are. And I'm sure many of you have seen or are familiar with some of this, so I'll go through a bit of it fairly quickly. But when European settlers first arrived in Vermont, the state was heavily forested. Deer could be found throughout Vermont. They were common in some areas, but most likely they were less abundant than they are today. Over time, as the state was settled, the land was cleared for agriculture. I believe at one point Vermont was somewhere down to about maybe 20% forested. And those early settlers, of course, with no real regulations, hunted deer year round for food. And as a result of the loss of forests and that unregulated hunting, deer were extirpated from most of Vermont by the late 1700s. There were probably a few that held on in the Northeast Kingdom, where mainly Essex County, where it really was never cleared. Eventually, hill farms were abandoned. Forests began to kind of reclaim those areas. And actually in 1878, some deer from New York were reintroduced near Rutland. And that population, as well as some deer that probably moved in from remnant populations in New Hampshire and the Northeast Kingdom, and maybe Massachusetts, eventually seeded the deer population we have today. So as those farms grew up and became better deer habitat, more and more of the state became forested, our deer population increased as a result. So if we look at kind of the history of this, so our first modern deer season was in 1897. We have deer harvest data by town since 1900. So what I'm going to show you here, the map on the left is each dot on that map is a deer harvested in the underlying town. We don't know the exact location of where people killed deer, but we do know the town. So if there are 3 dots in a town, it means there were 3 deer killed in that town. But what this will do as we walk through it is it'll kind of show you the distribution of deer across Vermont. The chart on the right is just going to show the number of deer killed each year. And so you can track how that changed over time. So we see in 1900 is deer were pretty sparse still. There's a bit of a cluster in kind of the Mendon, Shrewsbury, Plymouth area near Rutland, likely a result of that introduction of deer in the late 1800s. But there are deer being harvested throughout the state at the time. We jump ahead to the 1960s. We see that deer population took a little while to take off, but eventually we see what in ecology or population dynamics we would call exponential growth. The deer population really exploded through the 40s, 50s, and into the 1960s. And for whatever reason, and I don't know that anyone really knows for sure, deer hunting in Vermont from the beginning was always buck only. And I'm sure that was, with very limited deer numbers, they were trying to maximize population growth. And but it was, with a few minor exceptions in the early 1910s, 1920s, it was buck only. And that, of course, is not sound management, we know today. But what it resulted in was that rapid growth once the habitat, once those farms, those hill farms were abandoned and all that shrubby regrowing forest was available for deer, the deer population really took off. And as early as the late 1940s, department biologists began to write reports on the potential impacts of a growing deer population on our forests, on agricultural interests, et cetera, and began to kind of recommend, hey, we need to start harvesting female deer. We need to really slow this population growth down. That fell on deaf ears for decades. And eventually by the 1960s, the department was able to convince the legislature, which at the time controlled deer hunting regulations, that we need to start harvesting female deer, antlerless deer. And so there were a few sporadic attempts in the 60s. There were nowhere near enough deer harvested to actually affect the population. But by, I don't know, some stroke of terrible luck, typically every time the department tried to have an antlerless season, it was followed by a severe winter. And so every time there was an antlerless season, there was a dip in the population. And by the late 60s, some very substantial drops in the population. But those really had nothing to do with the antlerless deer that were harvested. It had to do with deer being dramatically overabundant. They had destroyed their habitat. And so anytime there was a hard winter, large numbers of deer were dying. And even through the 1970s, with very few antlerless deer being harvested, the population didn't ever climb back up to where it was in the 60s. Habitats were in terrible shape, and deer were starving. Lots of deer were starving every winter. And so finally, by the late 1970s, the department was able to convince the legislature and the public to go along with a plan to reduce the deer population, to hold it down for a period of years, and then once habitats had recovered, to allow that population to increase again. And so in 1979, 80, and 81, very high numbers of antlerless deer were harvested. That was helped out by one of the most severe winters we've ever documented in 1981, 82, and the population was reduced substantially. And it was held down through most of the 80s with much more modest antlerless harvests. But those low deer numbers caused a great deal of anger among primarily deer hunters, and ultimately led the legislature to ban the harvest of antlerless deer during our regular November deer season. I believe that happened in 1987, somewhere around there, late 80s. And that ban remained in effect until 2015, when the legislature finally ceded some of the last bits of control over some deer hunting regulations. So as a result of that, despite doing exactly what the department said they were going to do, we lost a very important deer management tool. The deer population increased through the late 80s and early 90s more rapidly probably than would have been intended. And eventually the department was forced to switch to what has been our primary means of deer manage or antlerless deer harvest, which is issuing those antlerless permits in the muzzleloader season as a workaround to not being allowed to issue them during the rifle season. Anyway, with a higher population in the late 90s, things looked pretty good for a little while. And then hard winters in 2001 and 2003 caused another decline in the population. That was followed by some more regulation changes in 2005, including our antler restriction, which has been in place since then. But generally, since that time, despite a lower buck harvest because of the antler restriction, our population has been fairly stable. But what you may have noticed if you were paying attention to the map as I went through that, is that the distribution of deer has changed quite a bit over time. So in the 60s and prior, most of the deer in Vermont were in central and southern Vermont because that's where the best habitat was. That's where farms were abandoned first. Conversely, today, we have a much more clustered distribution of deer, and they're not necessarily in the same places they were in the earlier years. So this certainly creates more challenges for deer management, but this distribution of deer is entirely related to changes in deer habitat over time. So if we compare today's deer harvest, this is from this past season in 2020, we compare that to the map I showed earlier. So this map is the dark green areas are forest areas, the light green is open areas, I think mostly farm fields, but any open area. What you'll see is that the places where most deer are harvested, where we have the highest deer densities today, are the places where we have more open land. We have more of that mix of forest and field that is typically better deer habitat, but it's really those open areas that are supporting deer. Where we have large blocks of forest, we have deer few and far between. And that is because the quality of those forests for deer habitat is quite poor today. The reason for that is that our forests are getting older. And more mature forests we have today with very little in the understory, they don't have much to offer for deer. There's almost nothing to eat. They don't really offer cover. Whereas a younger forest with a lot of vegetation within reach of deer, a lot of food within reach of deer, provides abundant forage as well as better cover, and so can support much higher numbers of deer. And so when we look at the availability of deer forage, or the amount of food available for deer as forests progress through the stages of forest succession, we see that there's a lot of food available in the early years, roughly the first 20 years. If it's abandoned farm fields, it might take a little longer to move through. But as those trees grow up and out of reach of deer, and they shade out the understory, the forest moves through a period that is very unproductive for deer. There's nothing for deer to eat in the understory. And so it's really those young forests that drive how many deer we can sustain on the landscape. And as I mentioned, that early period typically lasts about 20 years, but that unproductive period, because trees live a long time, might last 200 years or more, depending on the species, before eventually those trees get old and die and start to fall down on their own, create some gaps in the canopy, and we start to see some brush and young trees growing underneath, providing food and cover for deer. Most of our forests in Vermont are in that low productivity period that's going to take quite a while to get through. So really, it's this young forest that we need to focus on. We have data from the forest. This is from the U.S. Forest Service forest inventory and analysis data set. They measure inventory our forests throughout the country, really, but on public and private land throughout Vermont. And one of the things that we can track from that is how much of our forest is young, is less than 20 years old. And we see a very notable decline over the past 25 years, to the point where now in central and southern Vermont, it doesn't even register. There's so little young forest habitat out there that it really doesn't even show up. And even in northern Vermont, it's below the point we think would have existed prior to European settlement. So there's very, very little of this young forest habitat out there. And this is one of the best pieces of data we have to show a decline in the quality of our habitat for deer. It's actually very difficult to measure how many deer exactly can an area support, to get a real fine point on that. And so generally, from a deer management perspective, we don't try to do that. We instead focus on the health of the deer. And so what we track, or one of the measures we track, is yearling antler beam diameter. So for deer, antlers are like bonus material. So when deer start to be in poorer condition, antlers are one of the first things that shrinks. When deer are in better condition, they can put more energy into antlers and they grow bigger antlers. But a couple of things I want to point out here. So you can see antler beam diameters were pretty low in the late 60s and 70s. And then in the early 80s, when the population was dramatically reduced and held down, antler beam diameters improved quite dramatically to the late 80s or so, and they held up there into the 90s. But for the past 30 years or so, we've seen this slow, steady decline in antler beam diameters, but also in other health measures. We also measure body weights, reproductive rates. And this really isn't because we have more deer now. We don't. Deer numbers haven't changed substantially. They fluctuate, but they haven't really changed substantially in the past 30 years. This is because the quality of our habitat, or the number of deer that our habitat can support, is declining. To address this on a deer management side, in our new 10-year big game management plan, our 2020 to 2030 big game management plan, we've set lower deer density objectives than we had in the previous plan. And these are reflective of what we believe our current habitat can support. On the right side here was our management objectives in 2020. You can see about half of the wildlife management units in the state, we felt we had more deer than we can support. The other half, we think we're pretty good, and we're just trying to hold deer numbers at their current level. Now, I will add, deer numbers can and do vary substantially within a wildlife management unit. So just because we say, for example, in wildlife management unit J1, we want to decrease the deer population, it doesn't mean we need to decrease it everywhere in J1. Conversely, some of the units where our goal is to stabilize, there are absolutely areas within those units where there are too many deer. We're not really able to manage at finer scales. We just can't reliably get enough data. So we have to manage kind of broadly. But that's one side of it, right? That's the deer numbers side of the coin. The other piece is, well, what if we just improve the quality of our habitat? If we improve the quality of the habitat, it will be able to support the number of deer we have or more. So our department spends considerable money and resources on habitat management, but we're only able to do so much. The vast majority of land, including forest land in Vermont, is privately owned. And we do have staff that work with private landowners to improve habitat on their land, but it's a drop in the bucket. You know, we can influence thousands of acres a year, but it's still a drop in the bucket. It really is going to come down to, if we want to really improve habitat, and I think we should, for not just for deer, but for on an abundance of forest health benefits, or benefits that would be accrued by improving forest health. It's going to come down to private landowners actually working to improve habitat on their land. So I'm not a professional forester, and I'm not going to try to give people advice on how they should manage their land. Every property is different. There are different factors that need to be considered. I would encourage anyone interested in managing or improving the health of their forests and the health of their deer to work with a forester or other natural resource professional. But to kind of end this presentation, I got a few more slides I want to go through on some things to consider when managing habitat or when trying to improve the health of our forests. So there are three major factors that really influence the current status of our forests, both for deer and just generally forest health. And those are deer and the impacts deer have, competing vegetation, which primarily means invasive species, but also includes some native species that can be problematic, and the specific management practices that we employ to actually achieve our goal of a healthier forest. So deer impacts are rarely obvious. I cannot even begin to tell you how many people have expressed to me or to other department biologists that, oh, I've never seen deer browse problems in the woods, and I've spent all this time out there. And it's unfortunate, but the reality is deer impacts are difficult to see if you don't know what you're looking for. Deer rarely cause brooming like this photo. In fact, this wasn't even caused by deer. This is moose browse. When we see that sort of impact from deer, it's typically in a deer wintering area, a place where deer concentrate in the winter to help better deal with those winter conditions. And that's where you might see this sort of thing, but it's usually pretty obvious and pretty limited in its location. More often than not, when we see impacts from deer, they're much less obvious. We typically just see, it's more about what's not there than what is. So we'll often see just an open understory like this. And people might walk through here and say, well, it's just, you know, there's not a lot of sun reaching the forest floor, and there's a lot of green grass and stuff down there. So obviously there can't be too many deer. Deer don't really eat grass. Anytime you see deer in a field, they're not focusing on the grass. They're eating the clover and the other little broadleaf forbs that are mixed in with the grass. Grass is not a natural forest understory plant in most situations. If we build exclosures to keep the deer out, we see what it would look like if there weren't deer. In this particular case, there's an abundance of wildflowers and other forbs and abundance of maple seedlings. it's not that those things are there and browsed on the outside, they're just not there. And that's because the deer eat them when they're very tiny and they never get a chance to establish. So it's difficult to see. Just as a broader example, open forest understories like this are not healthy forests. They're perhaps aesthetically pleasing to some people. They might be more enjoyable to recreate in, but it's not a healthy forest. You need to see the future generations of trees should be coming up underneath. Now, in some cases, it's just a matter of you have a very dense canopy. And so when you see, you know, just bare ground or leaves and twigs on the ground, maybe there's just not enough sun getting to the forest floor. But in this particular instance, there are a few gaps. We can see the light coming in and we can see a lot of grass growing. Again, that's not what should be growing in the forest. We should be seeing young trees, shrubs, wildflowers, not grass. So this is an example of a place where there are too many deer, although it's not obvious to most people. Another important thing to consider is that competing vegetation. And like I said, usually we're talking about invasive species. And a lot of people don't know how to identify invasive species. And so they might walk into an area and say, well, look, there's lots of green vegetation within reach of deer. There's plenty for deer to eat. There's actually nothing for deer to eat in this photo. Deer don't eat invasive species. They probably wouldn't be invasive if deer did eat them. So what really, in a situation like this, you know, and I think this is why we need to consider all three of these factors, is even if you were to eliminate deer from this scenario, the invasives have become so dominant that you're not going to be able to regenerate native species. And it doesn't take very many deer to eat the few native trees that do try to come up through these invasives. So this is where we get this combination effect of having a invasive plant sort of taking over, and then deer, even at very low densities, effectively eliminating whatever native vegetation attempts to come in under it. So in this situation, you may have to deal with the invasives before doing anything else. As I mentioned, some competing vegetation is native. We often see fern-dominated understories in areas. Often it's a result of a combination of a previous timber harvest, often a thinning. And then because there was reasonable numbers of deer, which ate a lot of the trees it tried to grow, the ferns were able to take over. And ferns form a fairly dense mat on the forest floor. And again, even if you were to eliminate deer from this forest, you would not get native trees to grow because they can't compete with that mat of ferns. And so you have to address both the deer and the competing vegetation issue in order to improve the health of this forest. And then the final piece of the puzzle is choosing the appropriate management approach. And because we're talking about forest management here, we're really talking about logging. Poor past logging practices are certainly responsible for some degraded forests in Vermont. There's no arguing that. But good, sound logging done by a qualified and skilled professional is by far our best tool to improve the health of our forests. Again, don't just hire a logger to save a few bucks and have him go cut whatever he wants in your woods. Work with a professional forester to decide whichever approach, you know, whether it's going and cutting a few trees or whether it's being fairly aggressive and putting in some patch clear cuts. What is the appropriate approach given your forest conditions and what your goals are, your long-term goals for that forest? And most importantly, if you're going to do any sort of forest management, you have to also manage your deer numbers. deer hunting, because that's how we manage deer numbers, deer hunting is a critical component of forest management. Whether you're logging or not, whether you're controlling invasive species or not, you can't just focus on one of those elements. You have to really think of all of them at the same time. So if you want to improve the health of your forest, you need to harvest some antlerless deer. And I'm not saying you need to reduce your deer numbers, but you need to harvest some antlerless deer to at least hold them where they are. And you probably, if you have a degraded forest, need to take some active role in improving the quality of that forest. Ultimately, our goal, what we want, is to have complex, diverse, healthy forests that are resilient to the many stresses that we put on them today. As long as we have healthy forests, we will have healthy deer, and all of the other wildlife that live in those forests will be healthy. So that's what I've got. So if anyone has any questions, I guess we can open it up to those now.
Great, thanks, Nick. There is one in the chat box, and everyone else, you can go ahead and type those in the chat box if you have any questions or thoughts after hearing this presentation. So Dave is interested to hear if you have any thoughts on seasonal habitat needs and management, and how that may be affected by increasing development of outdoor recreation trails, especially on public lands. And his example was the Heinsberg Town Forest, but I guess any town forest could be an example.
Yeah, that's a great question. Our department has certainly been grappling with the potential impacts of outdoor recreation on wildlife generally, not just deer. And it's certainly a concern. I will say that. In terms of seasonal habitat needs, we do try to avoid putting any recreational trails in deer winter habitat. Deer primarily survive winter by conserving energy. The amount of food, it's not so much about how much food is available to them. It's about they store a bunch of fat in the fall. They're almost hibernating while awake, right? They store a bunch of fat in the fall and they just try to conserve energy through the winter. So recreation that disturbs deer in the winter can actually have a significant negative impact on them. So we definitely try to avoid any impact on wintering deer. The rest of the year, deer are pretty resilient to recreational impacts. They'll move to another area and then move back when the people aren't there. But that's not to say that that's no impact. So it's definitely a concern.
Okay. Someone noted that they appreciated the history part, something they were less familiar with, so thank you for that. Emily would like to know, are hemlock trees part of a good deer support in the environment? And what is the recent information on the number of hemlock in the general Vermont forested areas?
So hemlock is very important to deer in Vermont, primarily because hemlock is perhaps the most common, or certainly most valuable tree in terms of winter cover for deer. So hemlock trees, like most coniferous trees or evergreen trees, in the winter, they help, they catch a lot of the snow as it falls. And so the snow depth underneath them tends to be quite a bit less. And that makes it easier for deer to move around and conserve that energy. So hemlock is an excellent tree for deer wintering areas, because it does that, excuse me, and because it's very long-lived. Unlike some of our other coniferous trees that have relatively short lifespans, hemlocks can live for a long time. And so we have a lot of hemlock. That wintering area is probably going to be useful for deer for a long period of time. In terms of numbers of hemlock in Vermont, I don't really know how that has changed over time. That's more of a question for a forester. I don't know that it is changing dramatically, but they're certainly under threat from pests like hemlock woolly deldered.
Okay, great. Speaking of another pest, Alan wants to know if EAB and the death of the ash contribute to opening the forest to new regeneration.
It's a great question. And honestly, I don't know the answer. I think it will vary depending on obviously how much ash is in a given forest. If I think of like my own property here, if all of our ash trees died tomorrow, it wouldn't really have a big impact. We'd have a lot more snags, but those few little gaps are probably not going to be enough to, in most cases, get past even very moderate deer browse. So I don't think it's going to have a huge impact, but in areas with a lot of ash, it may have much more impact.
Great. A different Alan wants to know if landowners can get additional antlerless permits to control deer populations in their neighborhood. They have a group called the East Rupert Wildlife Management Area, and they post the land and give permits to a number of hunters. They'd like to be able to get antlerless permits to folks during the rifle season.
We do not currently have a program that allocates permits to landowners. There are a variety of potential issues with that. Although it is something we are looking into. Again, I would say, there is absolutely no shortage of antlerless permits available in the Rupert area. We did actually sell all of them this past year, but that was the first time in about a decade. So, I would encourage you to think of hunting those antlerless deer outside of the rifle season. The muzzleloader seasons, both of the one at the end of October and the December one, are good times to kill antlerless deer. And there's ample opportunity in those seasons to do that.
Okay, great. Roland had a question, slash walls, and I've seen a little bit in the forestry research side on slash walls. What's the wildlife side thinking on slash walls?
Slash walls are sort of an extreme version of just leaving tops on the ground as a means of deterring deer. I think there's some promise to them. I mean, essentially, you are creating a wall around a patch cut or a clear cut by stacking slash. For those of you that aren't familiar with what a slash wall is, and the idea being that prevents deer from getting in, at least for a number of years, until the slash kind of rots away. And I think they can be effective, but I think it's very extreme, and there's a large cost to that. I certainly would encourage people to try to leave tops in the woods when they conduct a timber harvest. And if your interest in that is in limiting deer browse impacts or making it difficult for deer to move through the woods, don't have the loggers cut those tops down. Leave limbs sticking up. Like, forests aren't supposed to be clean. They're supposed to be messy looking. So leave those tops kind of sticking up and trees crossing each other. And if it's difficult for deer to get in there, it's not going to make a difference if you have way too many deer. But if you're kind of right on that edge, it may be just enough to help your trees get through.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we say in covers, right? Mess is best. Wildlife like it messy. It's a good thing. Alan wants to know if you've seen Dave D. Colesta's book on deer management and your thoughts there.
I have seen it. I haven't read it thoroughly, but I think what I saw, it's a good book. I think I would probably recommend it to people, again, having not actually read through it very thoroughly, but Dave, he knows what he's talking about. He's spent years looking at deer impacts to forests. So he certainly has a sound understanding of how to manage deer in respect to forest health.
Yeah, early muzzleloader this year. Roland wants to know if there's going to be an early muzzleloader season this year in Area N. Roland, I'm going to suggest that you go to the March meetings and find out a little bit more about the proposals for the upcoming deer season. Nick, let me ask you a question, though. We've got a lot of landowners on the call about access. What are the issues with access, and how can some of them be addressed by a landowner?
Yeah, that's a great point. So from a deer management perspective, our biggest challenge with access is, is lack of access, right? That is the biggest challenge to deer management. Hunters cannot kill deer they cannot access. It's that simple. So there are, a million valid reasons for someone to post their property. But I think it is very important to consider, if you're going to do that, or if you're going to somehow restrict hunting on your property, consider that does have an impact on our ability to manage the local deer population. And I think allowing access for some hunters, I'm all for controlling it if you feel that's necessary, but allowing access to your land for some hunters, particularly those that are interested in killing does, is a critical part of managing for a healthy forest. And not only that, but helping us as a department achieve our deer management goals. I mean, we're getting to a point now where there's so much land that with restricted access that we simply cannot effectively manage deer in some areas. We can't kill enough of them.
Okay, great. Drew wants to know if you can go into a little further detail about deer wintering areas. He doesn't say anything specific, but I do think, many people don't think about seasonal migration. We think of migration and the birds leaving Vermont and going down to South America. We don't necessarily think of, deer moving from one forested area into a different forested area because of the seasonality. If you could explain a little bit about that.
Sure. So in most northern areas, including most of Vermont, deer migrate to what we call deer wintering areas to get through the winter. And typically these are lower elevation areas with an abundance of softwood or coniferous trees, as I mentioned earlier, that kind of help, reduce snow depths. Generally speaking, in Vermont, deer wintering areas make up maybe 10% of our overall deer habitat. So for a few months of the year, anywhere from 2 to 6 months, maybe in Essex County, we are concentrating all of our deer into 10% of their habitat. And so those areas are absolutely critical to the number of deer that we can support statewide. The rest of the habitat is important the rest of the year, but those wintering areas, deer are spending, like I said, perhaps on average a quarter of the year in these areas. And so those areas are absolutely critical to how many deer we can support. And again, it's really all about good cover and minimizing disturbance to those deer. They need some food, but they can deal with limited food in those areas, but they really need good cover that helps them conserve energy.
Great. All right, anybody, that's all I've got in the chat box. So, oh, wait, one just popped up. Hang on a second. Let's see. Catherine would like to know, she has 20 acres, which she calls excellent deer habitat, too excellent, she might add, in southern Vermont, where surrounding good habitat is broken up. She said slash is a good idea, but as you mentioned, it only works if there is not a significant overabundance of deer. Do you have any recommendations? They already have one person who is hunting on the property throughout the season. Looks like they do muzzleloader, rifle, and bow. It sounds like it's only one person.
So without knowing any more than that, it's hard to give a real informed recommendation, but my gut reaction is you need to kill more deer. And that may not be easy to do, but simply allowing one person to hunt on a property, particularly if they aren't particularly effective, and unfortunately many of our hunters are not particularly effective at actually killing deer, and that's what matters. You may need to let more people hunt. It does become challenging if a lot of your neighbors aren't doing the same thing, but my recommendation to people is typically be very aggressive. You're not going to eradicate your local deer population. You can be extremely aggressive in the number of deer that you take, particularly does that you would take. And if you can actually manage to harvest enough, that will have an impact. You know, there's not really anything you can do from a purely habitat management perspective other than, you know, fencing deer out of your property, which is a bit extreme. There's not really anything you can do to deal with very high numbers of deer other than reduce the numbers of deer.
Great. Liz wanted to know if we could clarify a little bit about the March and May meetings and what's going on at each of those sections. So if you just tell us, like in March, this is like the public meeting comment, and explain that.
Sure. So our March meetings, we have meetings in March every year to go over the general status of the deer population, you know, what we're looking forward to in 2021. We don't have any new regulation changes coming down the pipe this year, so this year will really just be an update on what we saw this past fall with our new hunting regulations, how those worked. And then in May, in May, we will have 2 additional meetings, and those will be to comment on our antlerless harvest recommendation for this coming fall. So that's where we, you know, recommend a certain number of antlerless permits in each unit. And so in May, it would be an opportunity to comment on, you know, whether you think we should be killing fewer or more deer in your area.
Okay. And T wants to know, does the state ever consider hiring or allowing professional hunters to reduce the herd in specific places?
Consider it, sure, but no, and I'd have to say that I'm not aware of any state agency that ever pays for that. Typically, hiring of professional sharpshooters is paid for by communities, local communities that don't want to allow recreational hunting. So typically, they somehow think that is preferable to allowing recreational hunting. And it certainly can be more effective because they're professionals, but it's not something we would support unless there was, you know, it had been proven that recreational hunting could not be effective.
Well, great. All right. Well, we're rounding on 1 o'clock. If anybody has any questions for Nick outside of this, or you have specific questions on the proposed hunting seasons, you can reach Nick at nickfortin@vermont.gov. I'll put that in the chat box. And thank you, Nick. We really appreciate your time and everything that you shared with us today.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Liz. And thanks everyone else for coming today.